All right, we've finally done it. After gaming on one of the worst GPUs I've ever used, the 6GB RTX 3050 from our JB Hi-Fi pre-built that frankly felt like we were scammed. Well, we've upgraded the system with this, the RTX 5050, and we paid 449 Australian dollars for this, which is about 300 US dollars. And yeah, that's not exactly cheap, is it? We bought this MSI Shadow dual fan model, the cheapest 5050 we could possibly buy, with a plastic shroud, minimal cooling, and all the signs of being built to a budget. But we were curious, is this actually a meaningful upgrade, especially if you're stuck with a downright bad card like the 3050 6GB? Is it finally a good budget GPU from NVIDIA, or just another overhyped underperformer? Well, if you're on a tight budget, and a lot of us are, or you're considering this card in your next pre-built, this video will give you the full picture. And yes, we're going to compare it directly to the 3050 in the exact same budget gaming PC, so you know if the upgrade is worth it. Let's review this thing. Now, we can't review this card without addressing the elephant in the room and one of the more unusual aspects of the RTX 5050 launch. Now, as you guys know, we're also one of the largest new car reviewers in Australia over at CarSauce. Every year, we attend all the new car launches in Australia and dozens globally, and we are very well experienced in product launches now. So we have some, shall we say, strong insights into how these things typically work. Unlike most product releases, NVIDIA didn't provide review samples ahead of time. There were no pre-launch reviews, and driver access was limited up until launch day. That means that most buyers have had little to no independent performance data when making the call to buy one of these. Hence, we felt the need to go out and buy a card as soon as we could get our hands on one. This approach is something we've seen before with recent 50 series cards. For example, the 5060 Ti 8GB had very limited visibility at launch, with only the higher spec 16GB version receiving early coverage. The non-Ti 5060, well, reviewers had hardware, but drivers were withheld until the launch. With the 5050, the pattern has kind of been repeated. No samples, limited drivers, and delayed retail availability in some regions. Of course, there may be valid logistical or strategic reasons behind this type of rollout that you and I are not privy to, but it does make it harder for consumers to make informed decisions, particularly when navigating tight budgets. And that's just not very cool, let's be honest. But we're here to evaluate the product on its own merit, and we welcome open discussion in the comments. So let us know down below, what do you think about this kind of launch strategy? Now, where exactly does the RTX 5050 sit in NVIDIA's current lineup? The 5050 is the entry-level GPU in the Blackwell desktop series. It features the GB207 GPU die, and it's built to be a low-power, compact option for 1080p gaming. It uses 8GB of GDDR6 memory on a 128-bit memory bus, giving it 320GB per second of memory bandwidth. That's a big drop though compared to the GDDR7 memory used in the RTX 5060. And right now you can go out and buy the RTX 5060 8GB for just $70 more at retail, which makes absolutely more sense to me. The RTX 5050 does support DLSS 4, just like the more expensive RTX 5060 and 5070, meaning it has access to frame generation and upscaling tech. That's probably its most redeeming feature. As for power, it has a 130-watt TDP and just a single 8-pin PCIe power connector. It's efficient, it's easy to install, and does not demand much from your PSU or your case's airflow. But still, it's a cut-down card in every sense, designed to sit below the RTX 5060, which again uses GDDR7, has more cores, and significantly better bandwidth and performance. The problem is, in markets like Australia, that gap in performance, it doesn't translate to a massive price difference, and that's where value becomes a bit of an issue. So what about DLSS 4? Is that the saving grace of this card? And well, yeah, it kind of is. DLSS 4 is NVIDIA's latest suite of AI-powered rendering features exclusive to the RTX 50 series. It builds on previous DLSS generations with several big improvements. Multi-frame generation. Now, this is a big one. Instead of generating one extra frame like DLSS 3, DLSS 4 can generate up to 3 AI frames for every rendered frame, massively boosting frame rates. Then there's ray reconstruction. So DLSS replaces traditional denoisers with an AI trained model that generates more accurate ray trace lighting and reflections, resulting in improved stability and finer detail. And then there's DLSS Super Resolution and DLAA. These both help to upscale low-res images to high-res output or improve visual clarity at native resolution using deep learning anti-aliasing. All of this is powered by 5th generation Tensor cores and trained by NVIDIA's own supercomputers. The catch? Well, while DLSS 4 is technically supported on the RTX 5050, your actual performance uplift will vary depending on the game, setting, and resolution. In our view, DLSS 4 is a big selling point, but it really shines on those higher end cards with a bit more headroom. Still, if you're gaming at 1080p and you need every frame you can get, it's a very valuable feature to have, especially as more games adopt it going forward. So, the exciting part. To test out this new 5050, we played the same 5 games that we initially tested the 3050 6GB variant with in our last video, so go check that out after this one. We also ran 3D Mark benchmarks to test out frame rate, ray tracing performance, and DLSS. So let's get straight into the numbers. On the Steel Nomad benchmark at 1080p, we averaged 28 frames per second using the RTX 3050. Using the RTX 5050 on the same benchmark, we were able to achieve an average of 72 FPS. This marks a very impressive 157% increase in frame rate. On the Speedway ray tracing benchmark at 1080p, we averaged 14 frames per second using the RTX 3050. Ouch. On the same benchmark, using the RTX 5050, we saw a performance uplift of 121% with an average of 31 frames per second. During both benchmarks, temps went up more dramatically for the RTX 5050 than the 3050, with peak temperatures reaching 69 degrees Celsius compared to 55 degrees for the 3050. That's not quite in the realm of thermal throttling, but it's something you definitely want to keep in mind because this GPU may require a bit of extra cooling. Now, despite the increase in temps, GPU clock speed remained far more consistent for the 5050 than the 3050, which would occasionally drop from a top of 1733 MHz down to 1620 MHz. Whereas the RTX 5050, it stayed within a range of about 2840 to 2880 MHz. Since the RTX 3050 only supports up to DLSS 2, we decided to compare that version of DLSS to the latest DLSS 4, which of course also supports Framegen on the latest 50 series graphics cards. And we saw staggering results. Where the RTX 3050 6GB saw an increase in frame rate of 135% from 21 FPS to 49 FPS using DLSS 2, the performance uplift we saw in the RTX 5050 using DLSS 4 was insane. We saw an increase in frame rate of 228% from 27 FPS to 88 FPS, while looking visually far superior to the obvious flickering and artifacts caused by DLSS 2. There were the occasional artifacts around edges and in reflections, but the results speak for themselves, really. In real-world gaming performance, we saw similarly impressive results. Now, all of these games were either played on medium or high settings at 1080p. Firstly, in Fortnite, there was a significant decrease in stutters, and where we were seeing an average of 88 FPS with 1% lows of 17 FPS, this was completely blown away by the 124 FPS average of the RTX 5050 with 1% lows of 90 FPS. This marks a performance uplift of 41% on average, though with far less stutter and overall a much more playable experience. In World of Tanks, we saw the average FPS increase from 145 FPS on average with 100 frames per second lows to 180 FPS on average with 70 FPS lows. This is a 24% increase in performance, though at frame rates this high, you'll probably start running into CPU bottlenecking, which could explain the 1% lows being slightly worse. For Cyberpunk 2077, we saw an insane increase in performance with both DLSS off and on. Using the RTX 3050 with DLSS off, we saw an average FPS of 52 with 1% lows of 45. Interestingly, this was increased across the board by exactly 100%, with the 5050 clocking an average of 104 FPS and 90 FPS for its 1% lows. With DLSS on, and in the case of the 5050, DLSS 4 with Framegen, these numbers got crazy. On the RTX 3050, we only saw a humble improvement, averaging 66 FPS with 1% lows of 25 FPS. Whereas the RTX 5050 FPS skyrocketed to 225 FPS with 95 FPS 1% lows. Visually, there were hardly any artifacts and ghosting was minimal as well. Honestly, incredible, with a total performance uplift of 240% using DLSS 4 with Framegen compared to DLSS 2 on the RTX 3050. Playing Forza Horizon 5, we got an average of 120 FPS with 1% lows of 105 FPS with the RTX 3050. It's very playable with DLSS disabled. On the 5050, this went up to 170 FPS with 110 FPS lows, which is an uplift of about 41%. With DLSS performance enabled with DLAA on the RTX 5050, we saw an average of 230 FPS with 190 FPS lows compared to the 120 FPS average and 110 FPS lows using the RTX 3050. This shows the power of DLSS 4 with a 91% performance increase. In Counter-Strike, which to be fair is very CPU intensive, we were already stretching the limits of our monitor's 240Hz refresh rate. We were averaging high 290 FPS already using the RTX 3050, and then we saw an increase to an average of 320 FPS on the RTX 5050. Notably, on the RTX 5050, you can run the game at 1440p with a consistent 240 frames per second, which is not something we could do on the RTX 3050. So over these 5 games, we saw an average performance uplift of 53% with an average frame rate of 193 FPS for the RTX 5050 compared to 126 FPS for the RTX 3050. So while yes, this card is capable of high frame rate at 1080p, these results would be far worse for 4K gaming. In fact, it's probably not really doable. So, is the RTX 5050 a good buy? If your budget is absolutely capped at 449 Australian dollars and you need DLSS 4 right now, the RTX 5050 does get the job done. It's cool, efficient, compact, and a noticeable step up from the old 3050. 6GB to be fair, particularly though if you're gaming at 1080p. Calling it good value though is definitely a bit of a stretch. You're getting 8GB of GDDR6 VRAM, a cut down Blackwell chip, the GB207 die, DLSS 4 support, which is good to be fair, PCIe 5.0 with 8 lanes and a 130-watt TDP with a single 8-pin connector. Sounds decent until you look just $70 higher in the market. For around 520 Australian dollars, you can get the RTX 5060 8GB, and that has GDDR7 memory with faster bandwidth, more cores and better ray tracing performance, the same DLSS 4 feature set, and based on the benchmarks I can find online, around 30 to 35% better performance across most modern games. Then of course, there is AMD's Radeon RX 9060 XT 8GB, available for under $500 in Australia at the moment. And yes, it runs hotter, sure, but you're getting up to 40% more gaming performance than the 5050. And if you can push it even further, the 9060 XT 16GB is arguably the best entry-level card for long-term viability, considering it has double the VRAM and can be bought for about $580. The RTX 5050 ends up being caught in this awkward in-between. It's clearly better than a 3050 6GB like we have right here. Not to mention, it supports DLSS 4, but so does the 5060 for not much more. And while it's technically the cheapest way to access NVIDIA's latest AI features, the sacrifice in performance and VRAM, it's difficult to ignore. And that 8GB VRAM limit, well, it's really bad for future-proofing. Some games already won't launch on ultra settings with that limit, so 8GB might be cheaper for you now, but in the near future, it could be not enough to even make use of DLSS 4. So if you're upgrading from a 1650, a GTX 1060, or even a 3050 6GB, and you absolutely cannot go beyond that $449, which for some people you can't, and I respect that, then sure, the 5050 is a nice little upgrade. But we'd strongly suggest waiting for a sale, maybe checking the secondhand market, or stretching for a more capable card like the RTX 5060 or RX 9060 XT. But what do you guys think about the RTX 5050? Is it worth the price tag, or is it too much money? Of course, if you did enjoy the video, please do subscribe and share this video with a friend. We're getting TechSauce big, baby. And of course, we'll catch you in the next video. Ciao for now.